Hello, it's Harry Brook here, agricultural fieldman with Flagstaff County, and today we're talking to Kelly Turkington, who is a research scientist with agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lacombe. He's a pathologist, plant pathologist, and today we're going to be talking about leaf spots and rusts. Now, this is not your vehicle rust. This is rust that can devastate a crop.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
Kelly, let's talk about the leaf spots first.
Sure. Great, Harry. Nice to have this opportunity with you. And certainly the cereal leaf spots are a disease that we monitor on a annual basis, looking at prevalence level. We have a number of trials currently, as well as in the past, focused on it. And I would say overall, in the case of wheat and barley, it's probably one of the main constraints as far as yield on a consistent annual basis. And probably the biggest driver behind that is in relation to the crop rotations that we see. So this sort of fairly ubiquitous canola wheat, or in some cases that may be canola barley rotation is a rotation, but you're only leaving a single year between your cereal crops. So that's not enough time to derive much benefit from crop rotation in relation to disease management. So it relates really to the extent of decomposition of the infected cereal residues from your previous crop. So with leaf spots, the inoculum by and large comes from crop residue. There are exceptions. So if you look at net form, net blotch, and barley, actually seed-borne net blotch can be a problem. But it's usually an issue where you have a very long interval between your barley crops, so 3 to 4 years. So normally, under our circumstances, it tends to be sort of minimized, and the main issue is in terms of cereal residues.
Right. So it's on the straw for the net form of net blotch.
Yeah. And so ideally, if you can, and there are various factors influencing a producer's crop rotation choice, is that you want to try and extend that rotational interval between your cereal crops to at least 2 full years of a non-host. And that can be challenging depending on the markets. You may have grown a lot of field peas in the past, but perhaps you've had issues with the Phanomyces. So that means that you have to use a very long rotation between pea crops. So if you can, try to extend that rotational interval. The interesting thing to sort of contrast it to the rusts, and here in Alberta, probably our main rust issue is stripe rust. And most of that will typically come from the Pacific Northwest. And we can talk a bit about that in a few moments. Whereas, the cereal leaf spots, the inoculum typically comes from the field the field where the crop has been planted. So
how far do those spores travel?
If you look at net blotch, they produce both a sexual spore and an asexual spore. And the literature really suggests that their dispersal is fairly limited, maybe within 50 to a couple hundred feet. Most of the spores that have been released would be deposited back into that crop. Maybe immediately adjacent fields would be at most at risk. And you see the same thing with net blotch and barley and spot blotch and barley. They both produce spores that they're called conidia. They're naked spores. They're produced on little stalks, typically, and those are the spores that will cycle on the crop during the growing season, and they're blown around by wind. If you look at scald, it produces spores in sort of a slimy mass on that barley leaf lesion that you see on the barley leaf. And it takes a droplet of rainfall to impact that spot and those spores. You create a film. Further raindrops will splash those spores from that infected leaf to adjacent plants, or from the lower canopy to the middle canopy. and so on. So dispersal there is fairly limited, probably maximum 25 feet, maybe if you've got some wind-driven rain a little further. The same thing occurs in a different structures with septoria, the two septorias that you have
there's a lot of that
wheat.
around.
And they produce these specialized fruiting structures called pycnidia, which ooze out these asexual spores called pycnidiospores onto that lesion. And often, if you look closely and it's been wet, you can often see what appears to be ooze coming out of these little black fruiting bodies, or sometimes they're more of a honey brown or golden brown color. And again, rain splash disperses those. So contrasting it to the cereal rust, those spores are very well adapted to a long distance trip. The spores typically are thick-walled. They're pigmented, so they help. That pigment helps them to limit impacts of radiation. So they're very well adapted to travel over hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers.
So with the leaf spotting and the spores coming from the crop residue, how many years will it be present with zero tillage? We leave a lot of trash on the surface. And I'm just wondering, so how long would there be fruiting spores coming from that the crop residue?
Again, if you look at the literature, and it depends on what kind of conditions, like if you've got wet conditions that occur over a few years, that enhances microbial activity, which can lead to faster decomposition of the residue. And they actually saw that in Saskatchewan with blackleg and canola back in the 70s and 80s. A pathologist there, Dr. Alan Petrie, showed that the blackleg pathogen actually survived longer in residue in drier regions, and attributed that to a slower rate of decomposition. So, but usually, at least 2 years.
Okay, so then a 2-year rotation really is not working well, is it?
So that sort of canola wheat wouldn't be great. If you can extend it to 2 full years of a non-host, that will help to reduce the amount of infected residue. But extending it beyond that, depending on the farmer's production practices, the markets they're looking at, their on-farm needs, may be pretty bloody difficult. So,
Another thing I was wondering was, I noticed a lot of the genetic selection and the varieties. You'll often get the barley that is strong against net blotch, but real weak against scald, or vice versa. And it seems to be really difficult to get a variety that's actually strong on both.
That's an excellent point, Harry. And I think it reflects the extent of screening that has been done over the years by different programs, the focus that they have. So here in Lacombe, we've had a strong focus on scald for a number of years, and have made some really great strides in terms of varieties with resistance. And some of the genetics they've obtained have come from ICARDA, which is an international breeding organization based in Syria, and then also with ICARDA CIMMYT in Mexico. But I know over the years we've seen issues with net blotch in some of the lines because it wasn't maybe as emphasized as much. So in about 2007 or 8, myself and my colleague Kikwan Shi with Province, or now Olds College, we went to the breeders and said, hey, we're seeing a lot of net blotch. We think we need to start screening for that. And eventually we convinced our colleagues that we should be doing that. So over the last probably 10 years or so, we've had active nurseries for screening for net blotch and spot form. That's been occurring in Saskatchewan with colleagues there, and as well as some activity in Manitoba. But, for the breeder, it's, looking at your focus, what issues you're concerned about. Obviously, yield is probably the primary consideration. And then if you're targeting the malting sector, you want to have acceptable malting quality in that breeding line. And then adding in these other things like disease resistance and sprouting resistance and lodging resistance and so on.
Beta amylase.
Yeah. And, it depends on the sources of resistance that you have, how easily you can introduce those or cross them into adapted lines. So yeah, definitely. But I would say if you look at the last 5 to 10 years and you look at some of the variety guides and you look even, I sit on the Prairie Recommending Committee for oat and barley on the disease evaluation team, and we evaluate the candidate lines that are proposed for registration for disease resistance. And it's to the leaf spot diseases, so the scald, both forms of net blotch, spot blotch. We look at fusarium head blight. We look at covered smut, loose smut to a certain extent, stem rust, and so on. And, I would say we've seen more and more lines come through that actually, at a minimum, have maybe an intermediate reaction to maybe one of those suite of leaf diseases, but maybe more of a much more of a resistant reaction to others. So we're seeing some improvements. And
yeah, I've noticed. Yeah.
If you can find a variety that has that package, that will go a long way. And certainly some of the work that we've done under the previous Growing Forward 2 program showed that if you have a variety that has an MR and R to a particular disease issue, and especially if that type of or level of reaction is there for other leaf diseases, the need to spray a fungicide in many cases is limited. You're really not seeing that increase in yield. So that resistance is doing the legwork for you in terms of minimizing that issue. Once you start to get into intermediate levels of resistance, moderately susceptible and susceptible, that's where you start to need to look at other options. So, your rotation maybe isn't long, and just to cut back on wheat, there is lots of, I sit on the Prairie Recommending Committee for wheat, rye, and triticale and the disease evaluation team. And yeah, they've got key diseases, but unfortunately the leaf spot complex is not a key disease. And often it's more of a collective assessment. So you're not looking specifically at tan spot, or you're not looking specifically at speckled leaf blotch, which is Septoria tritici. And then the other one is leaf blotch, which is Parastagnosperma odorum. And so we don't necessarily have as good of information, I would say, for the wheat varieties in terms of leaf spots. But again, the levels of resistance there are probably at best maybe in that intermediate to an MR category. So again, with that tight rotation, the varieties that we have in some cases may not have that complete resistance package. It means that we're seeing more of a reliance on fungicide.
Well, it bothers me because I've seen fields that are being sprayed, yet there's no sign of disease. It's almost become just part of the package of management, and it worries me because of the stewardship of those resources. If we overuse it, we're going to lose it.
Yeah, and it's often useful to look across the fence. So if we gaze across the big pond and we look at Europe, we look at the UK, they've had issues with fungicide resistance probably for about 30 to 40 years now, including in cereal type crops. And so they've struggled with it, and it's prompted a lot of effort and activity and sort of non-governmental organizations like the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee to look at monitoring pathogen populations for fungicide resistance, and then developing strategies to try and mitigate that development. So certainly the first thing is to only use a fungicide when you need it, when it's actually going to have a benefit. And if the risk of disease is low, and that continues from stem elongation to flag leaf emergence to head emergence, and so on, spraying a fungicide for leaf spot management is probably not going to give you much, if any, benefit. The problem is that it's a selection event. Every time that you put a fungicide on, there's a selection event on the pathogen population within that field. And it's not the fungicide changing the fungus itself. It's actually, if you think of it in terms of population genetics, if you can imagine a field, it's got millions, billions of individuals, if you want to call them that, within that field. Yeah. And a very small proportion of that scald pathogen or net blotch pathogen within that field, they simply have the genetics that confer reduced sensitivity or complete resistance to that fungicide. So yeah, talking about fungicide use and so on.
Yeah.
Ideally use it when you need it. And if there isn't a risk there, what we found in our research and what we've observed is that when there is no risk or very low risk, we do not see a yield response in terms of the crop. We don't see a response in terms of 1,000 kernel weight or test weight or bushel weight and so on. So the idea is that you use it when you need it. And then you layer on top of that strategies such as only using fungicide products that have multiple modes of action, and then alternating the products that you're using. But I think fungicide actives that have a mixture is probably one of the key strategies for fungicide resistance management. So if I look at leaf spots, and let's just take ourselves through the summer, sort of a virtual summer, the leaf spots to me are one of the easier issues to gauge risk. If you look at Sclerotinia stem rot in canola, or you look at Fusarium head blight in wheat, both those issues, you have to spray a fungicide before you actually see symptoms in the crop. In contrast with the leaf spots, they occur right from the seedling stage. So in the case of net form net blotch, you might have some seed to seedling transmission, but in most cases, most of the inoculum under tight rotations is coming from crop residues. So you'll see symptoms early on, even when you're out scouting for weeds. And I would say, based on our research, if you look at some of the recent work done by Sherry Stridehorst and a grad student Sherry had in wheat, most of our work has been on barley. We did a little preliminary work on wheat, and very, very consistent with what Sherry's found, is that spraying at that herbicide timing really is not providing much benefit at all. And there's a variety of reasons for it. The nature of the fungicides, yes, some of them and most of the newer ones and the good ones are systemic, but it's systemic in the sense that it's locally systemic, so it penetrates into the initial layers, or it moves from one side of the leaf to the other, or if it moves further, it moves with the water transpiration stream. So it'll move from the base of the leaf out. So it doesn't, let's say something like Roundup or others, it doesn't move from the leaf that it's applied to the base of the leaf, and then down into the growing point of the plant and into any leaves that are not fully extended yet. So that means if you spray at the three leaf stage and all the third leaves are out, you're gonna protect those leaves that are present and those leaves that are healthy. That fourth leaf that comes out, totally unprotected. The fungus will continue to produce spores from the residue, and the fungicide might have an impact on the lesions that are on those young leaves, but it's suppression at best, and that lesion and the fungus within that lesion will become active within a week or 2 weeks and then continue to contribute to the epidemic. So
how long does the fungicide remain active on the plant?
Good question. And it really depends on the product, probably anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay.
Roughly.
So 3-4 leaf stage is really way too early to get any to protect that flag leaf.
And I know there's this thought that you control the disease at that stage and it slows things down. And that just simply, in our experience and our research, has not panned out. The key thing, because after the herbicide timing, as it gets into stem elongation, what's driving that epidemic is two primary factors: the level of resistance in the variety, and let's say we assume it's susceptible or moderately susceptible, and the weather. The weather is critical. It's like you're putting your foot on the gas pedal and tromping on that gas pedal. If the weather is favorable, lots of moisture, moderate temperatures, that fungus is going to cycle. In the case of net blotch or spot blotch, likely 7 days. So a spore is dispersed from a lesion on a leaf. It lands on an upper leaf or a healthy leaf in an adjacent plant. Weather conditions are suitable, that spore germinates, it penetrates that leaf, and you have a new set of lesions producing a new crop of spores within 7 days. Scald, maybe 10 to 14. So it's like compound interest. So it will cycle on that crop after you've put on that fungicide. So in the case of cereals, It's the upper canopy leaves that are critical. So wheat would be the flag and the penultimate leaf, so the second leaf from the head.
Mhm.
Barley, actually, on a lot of the varieties, the flag leaf is quite small, and thus its contribution to yield is somewhat smaller. So it's the second leaf or the penultimate leaf and the third leaf from the head. So
Okay.
when people ask, well, how do I assess risk? Well, I would go out as the crop is coming into stem elongation, when that maybe third leaf from the head is out, or at just around flag leaf emergence. Look down in the canopy, look at that third leaf from the head, look at the lower canopy, the middle canopy. Do you see any signs of disease? And you have to make sure that correct identification is done, that the
Right.
symptoms that you're seeing are not due to some other factor. So you look at that, and if there's no disease coming or very little in the lower canopy, very little, if any, in the middle, that would indicate a lower risk. And I wouldn't assume that your job is done in terms of managing that. At the opposite end of the spectrum, if you see very extensive disease occurring in the lower canopy, you're starting to see lesions in the middle part, that and at flag leaf or slightly before, that to me would be a high risk. You should get in and protect those upper canopy leaves
Right.
at that particular stage. If very little evidence of disease, I would continue to follow that crop as it transitions from flag to head emergence and into anthesis. Scout, see what the leaf diseases are doing, including things like stripe rust, and then make that decision to spray or not. Because with some of these varieties, you might have relatively low or no levels of disease earlier on, but because of favorable weather conditions during stem elongation, flag leaf emergence, and that period from flag leaf emergence to anthesis.
But you still have to remember too, the product you're using and the pre-harvest intervals.
Yeah,
That's
so
got to be
that's
taken into account.
an important consideration. So you may need to go back in, or you may need to go in at anthesis. The other complicating factor there is fusarium head blight. So that, depending on which area of Alberta, if it's well established, fusarium graminearum in that area, and you've had routine issues with downgrading due to FDKs and mycotoxins, well, FDKs or fusarium damaged kernels, you may need to put a fungicide on for fusarium head blight, even though you might not have much, if any, leaf spotting in your crop. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind there. Yeah, and certainly stay within that label window, look at the pre-harvest interval and so on. Now, if we look at rust, there's a bit of an interesting difference there, I would say. And traditionally, our inoculum has come from the Pacific Northwest here.
Right.
If you go to Manitoba and the central to eastern parts of Saskatchewan, and you look at wind trajectories, most of those wind trajectories are coming from Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. So that's the main source of disease traditionally for the sort of central prairie to eastern prairie region. And it will move up from Texas and Oklahoma into Kansas and Nebraska, and it will cycle there and then get blown up. And you can get wind parcels of wind moving from Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska up into the central to eastern part of the prairies 3-4 days.
Holy cow.
Pacific Northwest. So traditionally, the main issues in that central corridor in the US, that Texas to Nebraska corridor, has been leaf rust.
Yeah.
And then, if you go back quite a while, stem rust, but it's mostly leaf rust now. However, in the last probably decade, and I think they've had the emergence of these high temperature races or types of the stripe rust pathogen. Traditionally, stripe rust is thought of being a cool season disease. It likes temperatures probably maximum 15, maybe 20. Anything above that tends to shut it down. That's not the case anymore. The pathogen has adapted and can develop at higher temperatures.
Okay.
So with rust, normally we don't necessarily start to see a risk emerging until sometime in June. So the inoculum is built up in the States. It's being blown up into Canada. And so it's important to be aware of the situation. So one of the things that has been in place the last couple summers, and it's continuing this year, and it's through the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network. And that's our cereal rust risk assessments. And those are done on a weekly basis from about mid-May. So we're getting geared up for 2021, mid-May through to early July. So what we do is we look at the rust epidemics in the States. Do we have an epidemic occurring? And that means a potential source of spores that can be blown up into Canada.
Right.
We look at that. We look at the frequency and number of wind trajectories that have passed over the Pacific Northwest in the key areas there, or Texas to Nebraska, and where they end up. Do they end up in the prairie region, and how frequently? So the more frequent they are, the greater the risk. And then we look at crop development in the prairies, and we also look at weather conditions. So that's sort of a heads up. So we can tell you areas where we've had wind trajectories coming from a source location in the States where there's a significant rust epidemic occurring. And in those areas, if you're growing a susceptible variety to stripe rust, for instance, or moderately susceptible, you might want to start looking in your crop for signs of the rusts. And it's extremely explosive. We've heard comments. There was a case, Kelly Cooley with, I think it's the
Pincher
MD
Creek.
of Pincher Creek.
Yeah.
It was about 2006, and he called, and there was a field of wheat that, I think the comment was, it went from a green color one week to next week, it was more of an orangey yellow color. And it was a highly susceptible variety. So the rust risk assessments and forecasts from the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network are a heads up.
Right.
Hey, there may be some issues that are going to start to occur. Coupled with that is that we monitor reports of rust, and we're putting up maps that indicate counties or MDs or IDs or municipalities where it's occurring.
Well, I know that Alberta Agriculture, with their Alberta Climate Information Service, they also have an app where they will actually produce a weekly kind of a weather gauge or a risk gauge, because they're taking information that you've been providing as well, and then putting it out as an application on your cell phone.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of the effort there has been with Fusarium head blight and the weather-based risk maps. So, so certainly, once you start to see rust symptoms in your wheat, and we don't necessarily see a lot of it in barley. There's some indications from my colleague Kikwan Shi that, it may be something we need to be worried about or looking for. I think our saving grace at this point is that if you look at the Pacific Northwest, there's not a lot of winter barley growing. It's mostly winter wheat if you look at winter cereals, and we don't have a large production of winter barley. In fact, very little, because it tends not to be very winter hardy, quite frankly. If we were to see a lot more winter barley in the Pacific Northwest or in that Texas to Nebraska corridor, we would probably see an increasing issue with stripe rust in barley. And it traditionally in barley has been a very significant issue in the past. So with the rust, the inoculum is coming from outside the crop. It's a biotrophic pathogen, so it develops and reproduces on living host tissue. So traditionally spraying earlier, even at a herbicide timing for stripe rust, has tended to work better. And I think it's partly because the inoculum is coming typically from outside the crop. Plus, because of the nature of the pathogen and it being biotrophic, there may be a higher level of activity on well-established infections. If you compare that to scald or net blotch or tan spot or septoria, often you'll get, those are necrotic pathogens typically. So they live off dead plant tissue. So that dead plant tissue is not going to conduct water, and it may be much more difficult for that fungicide to penetrate within that lesion because the tissue's dead.
Dead, right.
So, with rust, it's a caveat. So the herbicide timing, I say, for your things like tan spot, septoria in wheat, scald, net blotch, the two types in barley, and spot blotch, herbicide timing is probably not something you want to look at. Bit of a different story with stripe rust, and the earlier it becomes established in your crop, the greater the yield loss. And we're talking anything probably from 30 to 75% yield loss under very severe outbreaks and with a highly susceptible variety. So certainly with rust, keep an eye on it. The rules of thumb that we hear from the States is if you're starting to see about 5% of the leaves with symptoms, 5% of the area of the leaves with symptoms is maybe a threshold to look at spraying a fungicide.
Okay.
The other thing with rust, though, and especially stripe rust here in Alberta, is it can also overwinter on winter wheat. So if you are growing winter wheat, try to use a variety that has a moderately resistant to start with. Secondly, if it's susceptible, monitor that crop in the fall. Do you see signs of rust developing? And if you do, there's potential for it to overwinter. So work done here at Lacombe by Alberta Ag in the past, and they're now Olds College, Kikwan Shi and Krishan Kumar, who I worked with, they looked at overwintering of the stripe rust pathogen. And that's been observed in southern Alberta. Bob Connor used to be at Ag Canada Lethbridge, noted that a number of years ago too. But if you have a mild winter with good snow cover, that stripe rust pathogen will survive within that winter wheat plant. And then once the winter wheat plant starts to regrow in the spring, that fungus will become active again and produce urea spores, the spores that are important in terms of the epidemic. So example of that was in 2015, I went down with Krishan Kumar and Kikwan Shi to their nursery site and a yield trial site at Olds, just by Olds College there. It was mid-April, and the amount of stripe rust already developing on that winter wheat crop was unbelievable.
How much cold can it handle and still survive?
The literature suggests minus 17, so I suspect that's probably an average temperature.
Yeah, I mean, this winter,
yeah. So it really, with the winter aspect and the overwintering with stripe rust, it's a two-phase thing. I would look at the crop in the fall. Do I see signs there? And if you do, I would be into that crop as soon as it starts regrowing in the spring. And if it occurs that early, you probably want to look at a fungicide application at that herbicide timing, if it's stripe rust. And then you're going to have to plan on probably an application a little later on towards flag, or if you can extend it into head emergence and anthesis. But yeah, so, lots of things to think about. Certainly, putting together a foundation of disease management strategies is critical. Probably the biggest thing is looking at that crop rotation, looking at the variety you're going to grow, its resistance packages, the issues that you have in the crop. So in crop, field specific scouting to find out what's there. Knowledge from previous growing seasons will give you an indication that, hey, I've had lots of problems with scald. Maybe I should choose a variety that has a better package for that particular disease. And then if, your rotation is maybe not quite sufficient enough as far as disease management, and that's only one factor that a farmer will look at in terms of their crop rotation choice. I have to recognize that. And if the rotation is maybe not quite there and the variety and the market you're targeting, the resistance package isn't quite complete, and it's maybe not quite complete, especially in terms of the diseases that you've seen in your farm previously, that's where fungicide application can come in and be a very effective strategy for the leaf spots and rusts. You're talking 80 to maybe even 90, 95% control, especially with stripe rust. But even, you get a well-timed fungicide application, you get a high level of control in terms of leaf spots.
And for certain, use lots of water, because you were saying that the fungicides don't move around a whole lot.
Yes, so it's important to get good coverage. So basically the fungicide, when you put it on a leaf, is going to stay in that leaf. If it's something that's quite mobile, and a lot of the foliar products are not necessarily that way. There's some seed fungicide products that are much more mobile. Some of them are not on the market here in Canada. I've seen some in Australia when I've been down there, something like flutriafol. It's called in-furrow, or impact in-furrow is the impact is the trade name. Extremely mobile, readily will move from the seed to the seedling and up into the leaves that are being produced over several weeks, actually.
Oh, wow.
So it really depends on the fungicide product that you use, but water definitely, and you look at that, and again, it's coverage and penetration into that crop canopy.
Okay.
So gauging risk and then responding appropriately, looking at trying to mix things up as far as the fungicide you're using, trying to ensure that you're using a product with multiple modes of action. That will help you to stay on top of that issue and limit the potential for any shifts in fungicide sensitivity that might occur.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kelly, for that.
Yeah, very good.
Covered a lot of ground in a short period of time.
And I just one more quick
Oh,
comment.
yeah, sure, by all means. I'm not trying to cut
You
you
can
off.
get your editor, but it comes out of your comments regarding conservation tillage, and that's an interesting area, because I started as a young scientist here in Alberta as a postdoc, actually up in Beaver Lodge, and that's when I first met George Clayton. And I'd known Guy Lafond, who was in Indian Head with Ag Canada. I actually worked as a summer student for him at the University of Saskatchewan when he was doing his PhD with Bob Baker, a wheat breeder. But that was at a time when we saw all this excitement regarding the shift from conservation tillage or conventional tillage to conservation tillage. And, a lot of the concerns. How is that going to impact my ability to manage weeds? Will I have more weed problems? Will I have more disease problems? Will I have more insect problems? How do I manage fertility? And then also things like getting good seed to soil contact. And for me, it was a very exciting time to be involved in that research. And I had the opportunity to come down here to Lacombe and eventually move with the feds and work closely with George Clayton and Neil Harker and other colleagues like Guy Lafond and Karen Bailey and Randy Kuchar and so on. But what we found is that direct seeding or conservation tillage doesn't necessarily elevate your risk of disease.
Okay.
And the primary driving, we did some work looking at commercial barley fields in the mid to late 90s. And what we found is that disease was more closely, related to weather, so weather variation and whether it's favorable or not, and variety, and level of resistance. The type of tillage system used was not
significant,
not as important. And over the years I've been in fields, so there's research that's been done across the prairie region. You look at commercial fields. I've been in some fields, and probably the best example of that was a field of CDC Dolly barley in the late 90s in the Tees area here, just outside of Lacombe. I got called to go and look at a crop, and it was at the 3-leaf stage. And it was brown. It had a brown tint. There was spot blotch and net blotch there. And we looked at the crop, very, very much a conventionally tilled field, maybe 30% residue cover. But if you looked at the residue that was there and the stem pieces that were still there, they were covered in the fruiting body, the sexual fruiting body of the net blotch fungus. So talking to the farmer, he said after it emerged, we had about 2 inches of nice warm rain. Well, ideal conditions. So, in that field, and again, it's anecdotal, of course, but, it coupled with a lot of the research experience one has had or colleagues have had. So, I'm not as negative as far as conservation tillage and disease risk. The key factors are going to be weather. The crop rotation was also the other key factor.
I was wondering
crop rotation, and variety resist. Those 3 factors really drove the risk that you had. And, and I've been elsewhere. I had a chance to visit Ireland and Northern Ireland here in 2019. Still a lot of moldboard plowing there, very aggressive, very, very aggressive tillage compared to Canada here. And they still have ongoing issues with leaf diseases in their cereals, and
they're burying a lot of it.
And a lot of even if you go back to the 80s, and canola and blackleg in that northeastern Saskatchewan region where it first started, if tillage had an important role to play as far as disease management, we wouldn't have seen the development of that disease and spread in the 80s. I remember being in fields that were under summer fallow, but they were loaded with old stem bases and root pieces infected with the blackleg pathogen. So,
and that was one where I think the spore load was worse in the third year.
yes, that was again Alan Petrie. I think it was at least 2-year-old canola residue. Very good point. So yeah, so that's where this idea of canola, back-to-back canola and what is it? I can't remember the term. I'm getting old and forgetful, but it's where you grow 2 crops of the same, 2 years of the same crop, then 2 years of a different crop, and so on. And yeah, it's still, you're still host on host, and there is an elevated risk. But there was a thought that, well, the first year there isn't as much spore production from that blackleg infected canola residue.
But I mean, there's still some. So it's, and if you've got
so,
a susceptible species, it's going to be affected.
But very, very interesting time. I'm very thankful that I had the opportunity to work with people like George and Neil and Guy Lafond and Adrian Johnson, Randy Kuchar, and Kevin Bailey, and so on. So yeah, it was an exciting time.
Well, anything else you want to add as a final?
No, that's fine. But it's been great, Harry. You know, please, if something else that comes up during the summer and you need to do a post podcast,
maybe we could even have you virtually in the field.
Yeah, well, we could do that. If we've got a good connection, we could go out into the field.